Bill is a fourth-year PhD candidate at the University of California, San Diego, works with advisor Dr. Lindsay Powell in the experimental psychology department. His research program focuses primarily on early human concepts of social relationships and morality, so very much something we are interested in. He examines how infants and children use their observation of people's social relationships to guide their expectation and reasoning about pro-social and antisocial behavior. And so actually, I think he'll introduce the title of his talk. I am going to stop sharing. I think I'm going to stop sharing. I don't know how to stop sharing. Oh, wait, I do now. Hang on. Stop share. Sorry, Zoom is new. It's got new features and it's confusing me. All right, William, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that really nice introduction, Monica. And yeah, so thank you all for having me here today and joining this Zoom call to listen to my talk. As Monica said, my name is Bill Pepe, and I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the University of California, San Diego. And my research program, like Monica was saying, focuses on exploring how infants and older children learn about people's social relationships, and then based on those relationships, basically how they expect people to interact with one another, particularly when they expect people to act in pro-social or nice ways or antisocial and kind of bad or mean ways towards specific other people. And today I'm going to be talking to you all about my research that looks at how infants and young children can use their observations of other people's imitative and helping behaviors to make inferences about how those same people will act in the future. And before getting started with my own research, though, I want to first ask everyone just to imagine a couple of scenarios and what you may think about the people in these different situations. First, imagine you're walking into a grocery store and you see a man struggling to get to carry his groceries to his car. A woman who sees this man struggling runs over to help him with his bags and pick up all the fallen items. After we see this, we would likely think something like this is a nice, good, or kind woman. On a different day, you may be out to eat and the people at the table over are being overly loud and you hear them repeatedly berate their waiter over really minor issues. In a situation like this, you may think these people are mean, bad, or unreasonable. In these kinds of situations, we're using observations of people's actions towards other people, so situations that don't involve ourselves, to make positive or negative evaluations about those people, such as by inferring they are good or bad. We also know that adults readily use these kinds of social inferences to make predictions about how people will act in the future. So they don't just use people's good or bad actions to form evaluations about their past behavior, but use these inferences to figure out who's more likely to help versus obstruct others, provide support versus criticism, and act in other various good or bad ways. So while we use people's actions to make these kinds of rapid social judgments, whereby we categorize people using labels like good or bad, we also make more nuanced inferences that go a bit deeper and focus on why people are motivated to act the way they are. For example, we may see two people act in a way that leads us to think of them as good, but for really different reasons. We are likely to think our Good Samaritan from before. There we go. There she is. From before, who helped the man with his groceries, as a nice person who's willing to go out of their way to help others. While if we pass by a group of people helping another person move boxes into their new apartment, we're more likely to think the people that are helping are good friends. In both cases, we positively evaluate the actor or actors, but in the first case, we make a disposition-based inference, whereby we are making an inference about that person's traits and therefore expect that person to act in consistent ways towards most other people. In the second situation, we make a relationship-based inference, whereby we're likely to infer that the helpers are good friends with the person they're helping, and therefore would expect them to help the same person in the future in similar situations, but we don't necessarily expect them to act in similarly helpful or nice ways towards most other people. So, why does it matter to us whether people are inferring relationships or dispositions? Well, imagine if we see the same woman on the left turn around and help someone else with their heavy bags of groceries. This probably wouldn't be all that shocking to us. It makes sense that if she's willing to help one person with their groceries, then she should help someone else in the same way or a similar way. However, it would be pretty strange to see one of the friends on the right go across the street and offer to help someone else who's also moving boxes off a totally different truck. So even though we think of both people as good, we actually form different inferences that lead us to different expectations about how they're going to act in the future. And the work I'll be discussing first or today will focus on two overarching questions, asking whether infants are also interested in figuring out how people are going to interact with one another. First, I'll present some work that asks whether infants use their observations of people's behavior to infer who's likely to act in good ways that promote the well-being of others. Second, we'll also examine the nature of infants' inferences. So, for example, do they use their observations of a person acting in pro-social ways to infer dispositions, in which they expect an individual to possess stable traits that lead them to act in morally consistent ways in this broad general sense that's going to apply to most other social partners? Or do infants infer specific relationships, whereby individuals are expected to preferentially support the goals and welfare of their previous social partners, but not other people? While these are the two questions my research focuses on, in the next few slides, I'm just going to quickly talk about how we test what infants know, and then highlight the evidence we have that infants are interested in understanding anything about the socially motivated actions of the people around them. So to quickly talk about how we actually go about testing what infants know in our experiments, obviously, as you all probably know, just by your common knowledge, we can't ask babies questions or give them surveys like we do with adults or older children, but what we can do is show infants events that we think they'll understand and see if specific behaviors are affected by their understanding of those events. Specifically, we can use how long they look at certain events, so their looking time, to measure their interest in two different situations, to assess if they find something relatively more interesting than something else. So we use infants' looking time to see if they expect one outcome to be more likely than another. So yeah, to figure out what they expect to have happen. We can also see which of two objects or people infants seem to reach for. So if I offer infants two objects, which of the two do they reach for? So instead of figuring out what infants expect, this kind of task helps us determine if infants have a preference for one object or person over another. There are other ways people go about testing what infants know, but these two methods are particularly common and relevant to all the studies we'll talk about today. For this reason, I want to quickly go through how some of these studies are structured and how researchers expect infants to behave in these studies, just so we have a better idea of what I mean when I'm saying we found evidence of infants' expectations or preferences as we go through the rest of this talk. So first, in a study testing infants' expectations, we would start off by showing infants something that is meant to familiarize them to a certain set of events. In the video I'll play through now, we would just want to familiarize or orient infants to the set of objects that function as we would expect real-world objects to work. So nothing too fancy here, the ball just drops down, hits this solid table, and rolls to the end before stopping. After seeing this kind of event repeatedly over multiple trials, infants will see two different types of test trials. In one video, they will see a new expected event, like the one I'll play through now. So the solid wall appears to hit against a solid wall, which stops it from moving forward, just as we would expect real-world objects to behave. In the next video, infants will see an unexpected event. So I'm going to play through that now. So this time, the solid ball seems to magically move through a solid wall. And in a study like this, we'd want to know, do infants understand solid objects cannot move through other solid objects? If they do understand this, then they should expect the ball to hit against the wall and stop. And they should find it unexpected and therefore be surprised when the ball magically moves through the wall. Based on this hypothesis, we expect infants to look longer at the unexpected event compared to the expected event, as infants tend to look longer at things they find surprising or that violate their expectations. Importantly, that just to kind of explain a little bit about this, that wall that drops down is present to avoid infants just looking longer at the event that is visually more interesting or weird looking. So kind of to control for like perceptual cues about how things look, driving a difference in how long they look at the different things. So I just wanted to highlight that as a thing that demonstrates some of the things that we control for when we're working with infants. But here in these images, we get to peek behind the literal curtain and see what we believe infants understand is happening in each of these two events. And before moving on, I think it would be fun to see a baby participating in this kind of study, just to give you all an idea of how this looks if you're totally unfamiliar with these kinds of experiments. And the image the baby sees will be really small here in the top left corner. And we're going to talk about the specific study they're watching a bit later on. But just keep in mind, this is just to show how infants are seated during the study and how they behave when we're measuring their looking time.
Pepe. 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 Pepe.
Yeah. So we record how long babies look at different videos just like that. And we record how long they look until they seem to get bored. And the typical way we kind of determine when they get bored or are done looking at the specific video is field wide, typically when they look away for 2 consecutive seconds. And that's our prompt to advance to the next video that we're going to show them. And like I was saying, we're just typically interested with these kinds of studies whether infants seem to look longer at one video compared to another. But what if I don't want to know if infants expect something to happen, and instead I'm interested in figuring out if infants have a preference for one thing over another? If I want to explore infants' preferences, I may use a reaching task. So I may first show infants videos with two different objects. So infants may see something similar to before, but with an important difference like this. And the video is a little choppy on my end right now, but basically just in case it is choppy for you guys as well, instead of kind of this purple ball dropping down, they see this blue cylinder that seems to magically move through a wall, just like the previous videos we watched. And we could pair that video with the same expected event as before. So infants in this study would see a normal object that acts like objects in the real world versus one that acts in ways that real world objects do not, by magically moving through other solid objects. And then we could bring out physical versions of these objects and ask which one they prefer to reach for. In this kind of study, an experimenter would literally just hold two objects that look identical to those in the video in front of the infant and just prompt them to reach for whichever one they like. So unlike before, we aren't asking whether infants expect objects to behave in certain ways, but whether they prefer one object to another. And while these examples give us a clear picture, hopefully, of how we expect infants to be thinking about these kinds of scenarios in our experiments, I'm particularly interested in figuring out how infants understand the social world rather than the physical world. So what kinds of inferences do infants make based on people's social behavior? We'll be using videos to communicate to infants that two social agents, either puppets, people, or animated characters like these tend to engage in different types of socially relevant actions. In some of the studies we'll be talking about today, researchers asked, based on the actions of each agent in the videos, did infants prefer one agent to the other? And in other studies, researchers asked whether infants expect one of the two social agents to be more or less likely to engage in a particularly socially relevant behavior later on, based on their original set of actions. There we go. So, as an example, one experiment showed that infants prefer characters that imitate over those that choose to not imitate other people or other characters. In these experiments, one character imitates the actions of a primary target agent, and another always chooses to do something different. So, for example, infants in one such experiment saw three characters like these, and they watched as one character performed a certain action, depicted here by spinning. Another character imitated that action, again spinning, and a third character always chose to do something different, depicted here by moving side to side. After observing these actions, infants prefer and reach for the imitator over the non-imitator when an experimenter comes out and gives them the option of choosing from two physical representations of those characters. So basically two cardboard cutouts look identical to the characters that appeared on a screen. This suggests that infants use imitation to figure out who they're more like, between these two characters and This suggests that infants use imitation to figure out who they like more and therefore who they prefer to reach for, demonstrating that they seem to have some type of tendency to to prefer to reach for and socially interact with imitators over non-imitators. And other work has found that infants positively evaluate and prefer to interact with characters who engage in various helping behaviors as well. For example, preferring helpers compared to neutral or unhelpful characters after witnessing one agent help another individual up a hill, when one character returns an object, or when someone helps someone else obtain a desired item by opening up a box that someone seems to be struggling to open up on their own. So overall, across these kinds of studies in these different social contexts, infants tend to prefer characters who help others compared to characters who act unhelpfully by hindering, which by hindering, I just mean to actively perform an action that prevents someone else, from successfully performing a task that they're attempting to do on their own. And while some of this work tells us that infants prefer helpers to hinderers and other social actors like imitators to non-imitators, it doesn't tell us whether infants expect people to act in consistent ways with their past behavior. Typically, infants' positive evaluations for helpers and other pro-social actors has been theorized to be based on a dispositional inference, whereby, like we were saying before, infants infer the helper possesses a general tendency to act in a helpful way, leading to a preference for such helpful people. An alternative possibility, though, is that infants may be inferring specific relationships, in which they form an expectation that the helper places a higher value on the goals and rewards of the specific individual they helped. In the disposition case, the inference is about the individual who helped, and in the relationship-specific case, it's about the helper's pro-social attitude towards a specific other individual. And this is relevant as the two alternative accounts should lead infants to form different expectations for how a helper should behave in future situations. If infants see someone helping someone else as evidence of a disposition, they should then expect them to act consistently helpful across all future social partners, as the inference is about the individual's prosociality. While if infants are inferring a specific relationship, then they should only expect the helper to place a relatively higher value on the goals or rewards of the individuals that they've interacted with in positive ways before, but not necessarily other people. So this is the motivation for the experiments we're going to talk about next. First, do infants use their observations of others' behavior to figure out who will act in good or bad ways in the future? And second, what do infants expect to be motivating people's future prosocial behavior? First, I'll be discussing one set of studies asking whether infants use their observations of imitation to generate expectations regarding how likely someone is to help others. And afterwards, I'll be discussing work that asks whether infants use an agent's past helpful actions to predict their future helpful behavior. And one question you may ask yourself is why we thought infants would use imitation to make predictions for how people would act in the future. Or in other words, why we think imitation is a strong social cue that infants would use to make any kind of social inference that guides their predictions for how people will act in the future. And there's a lot of previous work that seems to indicate that infants within the first year respond to imitators in positive ways. As we mentioned before, infants positively evaluate and prefer imitators over non-imitators, as for example, in one experiment, infants overwhelmingly reach for the imitator compared to the non-imitator when prompted to reach for one of the two. The height of the bars reflect infants' tendency in this study to choose the imitator over the non-imitator more than 80% of the time in one such experiment. Previous work also shows that infants respond positively when their parents imitate them by becoming increasingly more vocal or smiling more often. And by the end of the first year of life, infants respond positively to other people besides their caregiver when they're imitated by those people. In one such study, infants were much more likely to socially engage with an experimenter who imitated their actions by making sure they were also following, the imitator was following along with whatever they were doing. So they would kind of stop, freeze, kind of make eye contact, and attempt to socially engage with this other party who had imitated them before. And these behaviors were much less when a different experimenter with a different set of infants avoided any kind of imitative interaction before engaging in those kind of play activities with the infant. So, across these studies and others, infants seem to like those who imitate. This is true when they themselves are the one who's imitated, and also when the target of imitations is someone else. Okay, so just to turn back really quickly to our original question of why imitation, imitation seems to be a social cue that infants are sensitive to really early in life that allows them to recognize people who are attentive to the needs of their social partners. Infants seem to respond positively to social partners who imitate them, and even imitators whose actions are directed at a third party. So, one reason infants may prefer imitators and respond positively to imitation is because these people are indicating they are responsive to the needs of their social partners, either in a disposition-based way, in which they're likely to help or respond positively to most other people, or in a relationship-specific way, in which they are attentive to the needs of those they've imitated in the past. And this is what motivated us to run the studies we'll talk about now, to figure out if infants expect imitators to be more responsive to the needs of other people. And the first experiment I'll talk about tests whether infants use observations of imitation to predict whether an imitator or non-imitator will help the target of imitation in the future. An expectation of helping towards the same target would be consistent with both the disposition and relationship-based motivation to help, but this tests the initial hypothesis that we were interested in of whether infants expect imitators to be more likely to act in helpful ways towards others at all. And to get at this question of whether infants expect imitators to be more likely to help, we first showed infants events in which one character imitated the actions of a central agent and another performed an alternative action. And here's going to be a quick example of each of those kinds of events. So infants saw this central agent turn to each side character and perform the same exact action. One responding character imitates that action, and the other always chooses to do something different. After seeing each of those events 3 times, infants then watch the central agent express the goal of jumping onto a colorful platform located behind an alleyway. And here's going to be an example of that event. So this was shown to infants to establish the central agent's goal of reaching the platform. Following this event, infants were shown the test events. In the first part of each test trial, infants saw the central agent attempt to cross the same alleyway as before. However, as you'll now see, there's going to be a wall blocking their path. So in 4 alternating test trials, in each test block, infants saw events that started in the same exact fashion, but that differed in regard to which responding agent helped the character they did or did not imitate before by pushing this wall out of their path. And I'm now going to show you a complete event all the way to the end of each of those events that infants saw. So across these 2 test events, infants saw the original imitator and non-imitator help the same original target in the exact same way by moving this wall out of their path. We recorded how long infants looked to each of these test trials, expecting that they would look longer at the events in which the non-imitator helped, reflecting infants' expectation that the imitator would be more likely to help. So in this study, infants observed one character imitate the actions of another. In this case, the blue character imitates the target by performing that sliding action, represented by identical bidirectional arrows in the top left corner, while the yellow character performs a different action in response to the red target character, represented by a circular arrow in the top right corner. At test, infants saw both characters provide help to the red target character that they had interacted with before, while the imitator was counterbalanced across participants. Here in the bottom left image is an example of the expected trial, in which the imitator helps, and in the bottom right image is an example of the unexpected trial, in which the non-imitator helps. Again, we predicted infants would look longer at events depicted in the bottom right corner. Here we're going to see infants looking time towards each of those 2 events, with longer looking indicating greater interest or surprise due to something unexpected happening. On the x-axis, you'll see trial type, the expected events in which the imitator helped, and the unexpected events when the non-imitator helped. On the y-axis, you're going to see looking time plotted in seconds. And we found that infants looked significantly longer at the events in which the non-imitator provided help as compared to when the imitator helped. Again, this is what we predicted, as we expect in these studies that infants are going to look longer at the things that they find unexpected or surprising, and therefore, if they had this expectation that the imitator was more likely to help, they should find it more interesting or surprising to see the non-imitator being the one who drops down from that ledge and pushes that wall out of the target's path, because that event is just a little bit more unexpected compared to seeing the imitator act in the same exact way. So overall, the mean or average for looking towards each trial type is represented by the red diamond, and each black dot is one infant's looking time towards that trial type, and the gray lines connect data points from each subject. So overall, this provides evidence in support of our initial hypothesis that infants expect imitators, compared to non-imitators, to be more likely to help or act pro-socially towards those they imitate. So we have evidence that infants expect imitators to be more likely to help the specific people that they've imitated before, but this is consistent with 2 explanations for what infants expect to be motivating imitators' subsequent acts of prosociality. And experiment 2 and 3 that I'll talk about now test whether infants are generating relationship or disposition-based expectations for imitators. In both experiments, infants watch as one social agent imitates and another doesn't imitate the same target. Then infants see an original target test block in which the target of imitation was held by the imitator or non-imitator. So a direct replication of the exact same thing that we just walked through, but then we also show them a novel target test block in which both agents help a novel social agent. Experiment 3 was run to address some limitations to the design of experiment 2. But the structure of experiments 2 and 3 were identical. So I'm just going to focus on experiment 3 and what we found. So in experiment 3, 64 8 and 9-month-old infants observed identical imitation events to experiment 1. So in each familiarization phase of the study, infants watched as the red target character turned to each of the two side characters, performed an action, one character imitated that action, while the other did not by performing a different action. In one test block, infants saw each of the two side characters help the same target as before. And again, this is just a direct replication of the events we walked through for experiment 1. And here, same as before, we have the expected event in which the imitator is providing help to the target on the left, and the surprising or unexpected event in which the non-imitator is providing help on the right. In the other test block, the novel target test block, the only change that happened is a new target character requires help. And infants see alternating trials in which the imitator or non-imitator provide help to this new target agent with whom infants have never seen either individual interact with previously. So during familiarization and in the previously shown original target test block, infants saw events that always included this red circular target agent. This agent was replaced with a novel social agent in the novel test block, this purple or rectangular character here. The test events were identical between the test blocks, except the purple agent was the target of help in the novel target test block. So here's just going to be one quick example of the test trials that infants saw in the novel block. So that's just a quick example of what infants saw, but as you can see, across the two test blocks, we always gave infants the exact same set of events, just swapping out the original for a novel target character. So far, we have proposed that infants' expectations from experiment 1 could have reflected inferences that are based on dispositions or relationships. And before moving on to what we found, I just want to quickly go through and outline the evidence from experiment 3 that would be consistent with each of those hypotheses. So if infants are reasoning about a specific relationship, they should expect the imitator to be more likely to help the target of their imitation. They should not expect the imitator to be more likely to help a novel target. And we should find an interaction across the test blocks, indicating that infants' looking time was affected by the identity of the recipient of help. Alternatively, if infants are inferring dispositions, they should expect imitators to be more likely to help the target of their imitation, the same as with the relationship. But also, they should expect imitators to be more likely to help a novel target as well. And there should be no interaction across the test blocks, meaning infants' looking time shouldn't be affected by who the target of help was during the test trials. And here's going to be what we found across this experiment. So same as with experiment 1, in the next two figures, we'll have on the x-axis trial type, the expected events in which the imitator helped, and the unexpected events when the non-imitator helped. On the y-axis, you're going to see looking time plotted in seconds. We again found that infants look longer when the non-imitator helped the original target. Thus, this directly replicates our previous finding that infants expect imitators to be more likely to help the target of their imitation. And we did not find a difference in looking to the imitator or non-imitator helping the novel target character. This suggests that infants did not form expectations that would be consistent with the disposition-based inference, as they did not expect imitators to help others in a more generalized sense. Importantly, we also found a significant interaction between trial type and help recipient, indicating or giving us stronger evidence that the identity of the helping recipient, whether they were the original target or a novel target during the test trials, did affect infants' relative looking to the trials in which the non-imitator or the imitator helped. So just to reorient everyone to the results we found across experiments 1 and 3, and here you'll also see the data from experiment 2. Experiment 1 found that infants expect imitators to be more likely to help the characters they imitate. We replicated the results from experiment 1 with a larger sample in both experiments 2 and 3, finding that infants again expect imitators to be more likely to help those they imitate compared to non-imitators. And we also found that they don't expect helping to novel social targets. So overall, these findings suggest infants use their observations of imitation to primarily reason about people's relationships, and we don't find any evidence of a disposition-based inference. So across all these 3 experiments, infants saw one character imitate and another not imitate the same social target. In experiments 1 through 3, infants seem to use the original imitative and non-imitative behavior of these 2 social agents to form expectations about who was more likely to help the same target in the future, expecting the imitator to be more likely to help in a totally new social context. In experiments 2 and 3, we did not find any evidence that infants use the imitative and non-imitative behavior of these 2 social agents to form expectations about who was more likely to help a novel social target in the future. So overall, together, this suggests, again, that infants use the social agent's imitative and non-imitative behavior to reason about their relative relationship to the target they interacted with during familiarization, and did not use their observations to infer a pro-social disposition on behalf of the imitator. What's really exciting about this work is that it's consistent with past research that has examined how infants use their observations of others to make social inferences and extends our understanding of what infants may seem to be doing. So first, one previous study showed that infants expect imitators compared to non-imitators to be more likely to approach the target of their imitation. So when seeing one character imitate and another choose to not imitate the same target, infants expect the imitator to be more likely to affiliate or befriend the target of imitation by moving closer to them. Another study found that infants expect 2 people who engage in identical arbitrary actions were more likely to affiliate with one another as well. So when infant C saw 2 people turn on a light in a way that seemed unnecessary, but both people actively chose this unnecessary arbitrary way of acting to do this thing, infants used this to infer the 2 people were more likely to be affiliated and would therefore engage in positive interactions with one another in the future. Importantly, when these 2 people seem to act in a way because of physical restraints, by kind of trapping their arms under a blanket, that prevented them from using their arms. This stopped infants from expecting that these 2 people would be affiliated, so instead of expecting them to engage in positive interactions with one another in the future, infants found it equally likely that they would kind of socially engage and wave at each other happily, as turn away while looking kind of angry at one another. So when you kind of trap their arms and they seem to do this action for a physical reason or because of constraints, not because they have this interest in imitating one another, that expectation for affiliation and positive social interactions disappears. So it seems to be something particularly about the act of imitating one another or actively choosing to imitate someone else that prompts infants to have this expectation for affiliation and positive interactions with the same target in the future. So yeah, this previous set of studies seems to indicate that infants use observations of others imitating one another to figure out who's affiliated, and they expect affiliates to engage with one another in positive ways. One really cool study from a few years ago asked whether infants could use their observations of who their caregiver chose to imitate to infer who's likely to be affiliated or a good social partner for the infant themselves. So in this study, infants saw one puppet make a distinct sound, and their caregiver chose to make a different sound right after. Another puppet made a totally different sound, and their caregiver now chose to imitate that sound. Infants showed a strong preference for the puppet who was imitated by their caregiver, compared to the puppet who was not. As out of all the infants who reached for one of the two puppets, about 78% preferred the imitated puppet over the non-imitated puppet. Infants also expected the imitated puppet to be more likely to engage in positive social interactions with the infant themselves, as they expected the imitated puppet to call out to the infant using their actual name in an engaging way using infant-directed speech. So importantly, infants did not show a similar preference or expectation for puppets who engaged with a stranger, so an adult who was not their caregiver. So infants saw the exact same interactions but with a stranger rather than their parent. And in these events, they showed no preference for either puppet and no longer expected either of the puppets to be more or less likely to positively engage with the infant themselves. So overall, seeing their caregiver engage positively with someone else by imitating seemed to prompt infants to both prefer that other individual and expect them to engage with the infant in positive ways. And to connect this back to our discussion at the beginning, we first talked about two hypothetical good people. One person who we likely believed was good because they seemed to be motivated to help most other people in a general sense, and another person who appeared to be motivated to help their specific friend. Across these different situations we just talked about and our studies that we ran, it seems that infants use imitation to figure out who is affiliated with one another, and thus who are good friends who are likely to provide help and comfort to other people, to their specific friends or positive social targets. Infants expect imitators to affiliate and befriend those they imitate, and expect these affiliates to help one another or engage in positive ways in the future. They also use their observations of their caregivers' imitative social interactions to evaluate others and figure out who's likely to interact with the infant themselves in positive ways. So we discussed and we found with our studies evidence that infants seem to use at least one pro-social or pro-affiliative behavior imitation to infer who's more likely to help others in the future, and that their expectations appear to be based on relationships. Next, we ran a different set of experiments that asked about infants' inferences from observations of helping. And the experiments we'll talk about next asked whether infants expected a previous helper compared to a hinderer or someone who acts unhelpfully to help the same target in new contexts. So similar to our imitation work, this first experiment assesses whether infants expect characters who help compared to those who hinder to be more likely to help in the future. So relevant to our first big question of whether infants expect certain people to act in good or bad ways. I'll now play through a couple of quick videos of the familiarization events infants saw in this study. So in one video, a character helps the target push a boulder up a hill, and in another video, a different character pushes the same target individual and the boulder back down the hill. This gives us an original helper and hinderer. The test trials were identical to the test events from our imitation work, just with this set of characters. So I'm not going to play through another video example of those, but we'll walk through a diagram of the study together now. So in experiment 1, infants observe familiarization events in which one agent consistently helps while another consistently hinders the same social partner. Infants later saw the original helper and the original hinderer now help the same social partner achieve a new goal. Here we have an example of the expected event in which the original helper is providing help to the original target on the left, and the surprising or unexpected event in which the original hinderer later helps on the right. We hypothesized that infants would expect the original helper to be more likely to help in this new context, and thus infants would look longer when the original hinderer helped instead. Here's going to be what we found in this study. And again, same as before, we're going to have trial type on the x-axis and looking time plotted in seconds on the y. We found that infants look significantly longer when the original hinderer helped the target agent compared to when the original helper helped in the test trials. These results are consistent with our hypothesis and provided evidence that infants expect individuals who help others to then be more likely to help in a totally new social context. However, this study was not meant to, on its own, provide any indication of whether infants are engaging in relationship or disposition-based inferences, but this was going to be the goal of our next experiment. And in this second experiment, we asked whether infants expect helping towards a novel social agent. So infants saw one character help and another hinder one target, and then both helped this new target later on. Identical to our imitation work, if infants use helping to infer relationships, then we should only find evidence that they expect helpers to be more likely to help their original target, but not the novel target. So in experiment 2, 52 14 and 15-month-old infants observed the exact same familiarization events from experiment 1, with all the same characters. Infants then saw a new set of helping test trials with the exact same objects and sequence of actions as experiment 1. However, the target of help was now a novel social agent with whom the original helper and hinderer had not interacted with previously. And here we have an example of the expected event in which the original helper is providing help to the novel target on the left, and the surprising or unexpected event in which the original hinderer later helps on the right. And same as with our previous experiments, across the next two figures, we'll have on the x-axis trial type, and on the y-axis, you'll see looking time plotted in seconds. We did not find a difference in looking when either character helped the novel target. This indicates that infants did not form expectations that would be consistent with the disposition-based motivation to help. When comparing the data across experiments 1 and 2, we also found a significant interaction between trial type and experiment, indicating that the identity of the help recipient, whether they were the original target or a novel target, significantly affected relative looking to trials in which the original helper or hinderer helped, giving us stronger evidence that infants seem to be making these relationship-based inferences. So overall, across both experiments 1 and 2, infants saw one character help and another hinder the same social target. In experiment 1, infants seemed to use the original helping and hindering behavior of these two social agents to form expectations about who was more likely to help the same target in the future, expecting the original helper to be more likely to help in a totally new social context. In experiment 2, we did not find any evidence that infants used the original helping and hindering behavior of these two social agents to form expectations about who was more likely to help a novel social target in the future. Together, this suggests that infants use the social agent's original helping and hindering behavior to reason about the relationship to the target they helped or hindered, and did not use their observations to infer a pro-social disposition. And to bring up the same example from the beginning, so we asked a similar question to our imitation work: would infants use their observations of someone helping to infer a disposition or relationship-based motivation to act helpfully? And once again, we found that infants use their observations to infer relationships, whereby they expect helpers to help their previous target in the future, but did not expect a helper or hinderer to be more likely to help someone new in the future. So across the two sets of experiments from our lab that I've talked about so far, we assessed whether infants expect certain social actors to be more likely to engage in positive social interactions in the future. We found that infants expect imitators compared to non-imitators, and helpers compared to hinderers to be more likely to act in helpful ways in the future. We also asked what was the nature of infants' expectations. Did they expect people to be motivated by a pro-social disposition, whereby they were more likely to help others in a general sense? Or did they expect people to be motivated to preferentially help those they appeared to possess a strong positive relationship with? we found evidence that infants primarily use their observations of imitation and helping to reason about people's relationships, as they expect imitators and helpers to help their original target in their futures, but did not expect them to be more likely to help new people with whom infants have never seen them interact with before the test trials. Yeah. One reason this is quite interesting is because we know that this isn't how adults always reason about people's prosocial behavior. By adulthood, there's a lot of evidence that people consider both others' relationships and their dispositions or traits when predicting how they'll act in the future. In regards to relationships, adults take into account the strength and type of social relationships people have with others when predicting how two people are likely to interact. For example, it's totally normal to hug a good friend or a family member, but it would be inappropriate to walk up to a random stranger and give them a big hug on the street. A more realistic example may be that you're more likely to feel obligated if your partner or a family member asks you for a ride to the airport, but you may feel less obligated to provide the same type of help to a more casual friend, and you may feel really shocked if someone you consider just to be an acquaintance asks you for a ride to the airport. In addition to all of that, adults also think, there we go, that friends are more likely to help one another than to help a stranger, and tend to like people who provide help to their friends. Adults also like friends who preferentially support them by working against rivals. So we like when friends support us directly by providing help or support, but also when they work against people who are our rivals or seem to dislike us or actively work against our goals or rewards, as this also indicates support, just in a less direct fashion. As for adults' trait-based inferences, adults use observations of people's behavior to make trait inferences whereby they expect people to act in ways that are consistent with their past behavior. For example, adults expect people who help one person in one situation to be more likely to help other people in totally different situations. So one really basic example, if you see one person help someone off the ground, you might expect that person to act like our Good Samaritan from before and kind of run over to somebody who seems to be struggling carrying their groceries and maybe open a door for them, help them get the bags in their car, or act in other kind of similar helpful ways in the future. Adults also make quicker and stronger trait inferences based on morally relevant behaviors. So adults are more likely to infer someone is nice or helpful than a person is intelligent or persistent or something that is less morally relevant. Also, once they make moral trait inferences, adults expect moral traits like niceness or helpfulness to be more stable over time and be more stable across different situations compared to non-moral traits. So these findings between infants and adults raise an interesting question. How do humans go from primarily reasoning about relationships to making more adult-like trait inferences, whereby we make quick, snap judgments of other people that lead to more generalized expectations about how these people act in the future? While this is going to be way beyond the scope of just a few studies to answer, the next set of experiments I'm going to talk to you about is our initial attempt at exploring how our social reasoning changes as we mature. Specifically, the next set of experiments will test how older children think about the same kind of social interactions that we showed infants. Before we talk about the studies that we ran in our lab, I'm going to talk through some of what we already know about how children think about these traits and what motivated us to run this next set of experiments. So first, in early to middle childhood, children are able to make certain trait inferences about people, similar to those of adults. Children use trait labels provided by others to make predictions that people will act in ways that are consistent with that trait label. So, for example, children expect someone they are told by an adult is nice to help others. So, for example, they'll expect someone labeled as nice to help someone else off the ground when they see that person fall down. And second, children can use their observations of people's behavior to assign consistent trait labels. So, for example, children will label someone they see help others. So if they see someone help someone else off the ground, they themselves are more likely to label that person as nice than they are to label that person as mean. At the same age, so that early to middle childhood range, where children are succeeding at these kinds of tasks, they struggle to make reliable behavior to behavior inferences, whereby they fail to use direct observations of people's past good or bad actions to predict how they'll act in the future. So, for example, they won't expect someone who appears to help someone off the ground act in other helpful ways later on. And I'm going to quickly highlight one study that found no evidence that children made behavior to behavior inferences, just to get an idea of how these studies were structured. So to start, children are shown an image like this and read a short story. You'll notice that the character is purposely turned away, and this was to prevent children from responding to a character's apparent emotions, so whether they appear happy or sad by different outcomes. I just want to highlight I just wanted to highlight this as I know this can look kind of odd, like why is the character turned away? But yeah, that's the reason for that. And in this study, when seeing this, children were told something like, here's Johnny at the store. He is buying some candy. A woman accidentally knocks over a cereal box. Look, Johnny picks up the cereal box and stacks it back up. So after hearing a short story like this, children were prompted to predict if the same character would help others in a new situation. So children were then read, one day, Johnny goes to his aunt's house to play with his cousins, and when he gets there, they are all cleaning up their toys. What does Johnny do when he sees them cleaning up their toys? Does he stay and clean up the toys? Or does he not help clean up and goes home? When given this behavioral evidence that Johnny is nice, in that original kind of short little blurb that I read you, they don't use this evidence to predict that Johnny is more likely to help in the future by helping his cousins. So on this graph, on the x-axis, you'll see three different age groups. On the y-axis, you'll see the percentage of time children in each age group predicted that Johnny would engage in trait-consistent behaviors. And that little dash or straight line is the 50% mark, indicating that children were equally likely to answer that Johnny would help as to not help. And as you can see, across all the three different age groups, children were pretty much at chance in responding whether Johnny was significantly more or less likely to help. However, what's interesting is with a different group of children in the exact same set of studies, a different group of children were told something like the following without given any evidence of Johnny acting one way or the other. So they were just told, this is Johnny, and he is nice. Johnny is a very nice boy. This group of children were then asked the same exact kind of test questions regarding whether they would predict Johnny would help others in the future. And now you're going to see a second line appear in the graph on the screen. And this time, when given a trait label such as nice, children use this to predict that the character would act in trait-consistent ways. And just to map this on quickly onto the similar set of examples from our discussion at the beginning today, if children are told that the person in this picture is nice, then they will use that trait label to predict how they will act in the future, and are more likely to predict that this person will engage in nice behaviors, such as by helping someone else pick up their fallen groceries. Similarly, children can do the reverse inference. If we don't provide a trait label, so we never tell children that the person on the left is nice or a good person, but show that person acting in nice ways, such as by helping the person on the right with their groceries, and then ask children if that person is nice or mean. Children are more likely to say that person is nice. What children consistently fail to do when there is no provided trait label is to use a person's helping or other nice actions towards one person to predict how they will act towards most other people in the future. And up until now, it isn't clear why children have struggled to make this behavior to behavior type of inference, given that they can assign morally consistent trait labels based on people's past behavior, and they predict consistent behavior from people who are assigned a trait label by others. And this is the question we wanted to ask. Why do children struggle to use their observations of people's actions to predict how they will act in the future? And we designed a set of experiments that address two major limitations of prior research. First, children may require strong evidence that someone is morally good before they will use their observations to predict trait-consistent behavior, and previous studies may not have provided evidence that allowed children to make this kind of inference. Helping someone off the ground who fell, opening the door for someone, or other low-cost forms of helping like picking up a cereal box may be seen as more of a norm for how someone should act in a situation, rather than indicating their willingness to act in a particular way in the future, especially when the cost of acting becomes greater. Secondly, children may use their observations of people's nice or mean actions to reason about their relationships, and not their traits or dispositions. As such, they may expect consistent behavior when the social partners are identical across events, but not use a person's actions towards one person to form expectations about how they'll act towards most others. The first experiment I'm going to talk about today was designed to address these two potential reasons for children's past struggles, testing whether children expect someone who engages in costly forms of helping or hindering to later engage in consistent behaviors towards the same social target, meaning the person they either helped or hindered before. So in the first of two experiments I'll talk about now, we designed stories which highlight important parts of social interactions that we believed would allow children to make stronger inferences about how characters would behave in the future compared to past studies. Children were introduced to these two characters that are on your screen, the protagonist who chose to help or not help, and the target who is in need of help. In each story, we emphasize that acting in a helpful or unhelpful way required the protagonist to incur a cost to intervene, and that the target required help to complete their task. So children were shown a simple image of these two characters with a set of objects, and then read a short story. So for example, some kids heard a story like this. This is Larry and David. One day, Larry was playing with his favorite toy, Play-Doh. Larry was excited because he had just enough Play-Doh to build a blue dog. Before he started building, Larry saw that David was trying to build a blue house with his own Play-Doh, but didn't have enough. Larry gave David his Play-Doh so David could build his blue house. Larry didn't have enough Play-Doh left, so he didn't build anything. So in this example, the protagonist acts in a way that allows the needy target to accomplish their goal, but in doing so incurs a cost that prevents them from completing their own task. So hopefully we eliminate this kind of norm-based expectation that the protagonist should or should not act in a particular way. He's sacrificing his own resource, but in doing so, helps this needy target accomplish their goal. So it kind of goes above and beyond these normative expectations that we have that people should either act in this helpful way or not act. And hopefully, therefore, it gives children a stronger set of evidence that this person was morally motivated to act in a particularly helpful or unhelpful way. And in our entire sample of 96 4 to 7-year-old children, each child was assigned to one of three conditions: helping, hindering, or neutral. In the helping condition, children were told that the protagonist incurred a cost to help the target complete a task. In the hindering condition, children were told the protagonist incurred a cost to prevent the target from completing a task. And in the neutral condition, the protagonist chose to complete their own task, and the target was not able to complete their own task since nobody gave them the help they needed. In all the conditions, after being read the initial story, children were then asked a set of 3 different test questions, assessing whether they expected the protagonist to help the same target in different future events. And here's the data from the 96 children who participated in experiment 1. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of responses to each question. On the x-axis, we have the 3 potential responses. Each bar represents the proportion of children's responses in a particular condition. The dotted line is the 33% mark indicating chance, which is what we could expect if children are not using the protagonist's helping or hindering behavior to predict how they will act in the future, since children were given the option of responding no, maybe, or yes. and we found a significant effect of condition on children's responses. Our data suggests that children generally expected the protagonist in the helping condition to act more helpfully than the protagonist in the neutral or hindering condition. And children in the neutral condition expected the protagonist to help more often than children in the hindering condition. The main takeaway is that children in the helping condition expected the protagonist to be more likely to help than kids in the hindering or neutral condition. So we talked earlier about past research that showed children seem to use trait labels to predict behavior and use observations of people's behavior to assign consistent trait labels. So people who help are labeled nice by children, and people who are labeled nice are expected to help in the future. But past research found no evidence that children used their observations of people's behavior to directly predict how they would act in the future. What's great about the study that we ran, when we give children strong enough evidence that this character seemed socially motivated to act on behalf of the target they're helping, they were able to do this. So the main, and I'm going to go a little quicker because I think I'm running short on time. So the main takeaway from this is that when we give children like a little bit of stronger evidence that this character was socially motivated to act in this way, they do seem to be able to perform this behavior to behavior inference that they hadn't been able to do before. But the next question we wanted to ask was whether this was also something about the specific relationships that they saw the protagonists engage in, or if they did seem to be using cost or the willingness of the person to engage in the social action, regardless of the social target, to make a more kind of trait consistent inference, and therefore would expect the protagonist to engage in a more generalized kind of pro-social way in the future. So in experiment 2, to get at this question, children saw events that were almost identical to experiment 1, except the target of help during the test questions was a new social target. Children were read a story identical to experiment 1, and then asked if they expect the protagonist to help a new target in the future. The test questions were the exact same ones as experiment 1, just depicting a new or novel target. And here we're going to have a similar setup to the previous graphs. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of responses to each question. On the x-axis, we have the 3 potential responses. Each bar is represented by the proportion, each bar represents the proportion of children's responses in a particular condition. And the dotted line is the 33% mark indicating chance. And the graph will be separated by experiment, with experiment 1 appearing on the left and experiment 2 with the novel target appearing on the right. So first, we have the data we already looked at from experiment 1, showing children's responses based on condition when the target of help was the same across the initial story and the test scenarios. And here we have the same type of graph for experiment 2. And what we found were children's responses were similar across the 2 experiments. When the target of help during the test scenarios was a new character in experiment 2, children in the helping condition continue to expect the protagonist to be more likely to help than children in the neutral or hindering condition. Okay. So in regards to what made our study different and enabled children to make these kinds of behavior to behavior inferences they struggled to make in the past, it seems like the cost of the protagonist was particularly important. But the relationships were not as important, at least in this social context. So everything we've talked about today, taken together, we see that both infants and children are able to use their observations of people's social interactions to infer who's likely to act in good or bad ways in the future. And while infants appear to use their observations to infer relationships, children seem to use the same types of observations to infer dispositions or traits that guide their expectations for how those people act towards most others. Currently, we're kind of following up on all this work, and I think one exciting avenue where our research is going is seeing if we can give children strong enough evidence of a protagonist character favoring a particular other person to kind of elicit more or stronger relationship-based expectations. So basically, do children understand that in some context, a certain person is more likely to favor someone compared to someone else? But that is a talk for a future time. So I'm just going to end by saying thank you all for listening, and thanks to everyone who worked on my projects, including my advisor, Lindsay Powell, to the top left, collaborators on the top right, members of the SoCal lab at UCSD at the bottom left, and the research assistants who've helped with these projects to the bottom right.